Hi everybody, welcome back. This week is the second to last lecture that we have for the semester, and this week in particular we're going to be focusing on the war on drugs. So to begin with, when we're talking about the war on drugs, we're really focusing on a couple different things. We're looking at the economic impacts of these policies. We're looking at the social and political climates also surrounding this type of legislation. And really, when we're talking about the topic of the war on drugs, we're talking about everything that has taken place since Nixon has declared the actual war on drugs, using that language in 1971 when he declared it part of his administration's mission to help eradicate some of the drug problems that we were seeing in the nation at this time. But before we get to the declaration that he made in 71, we have to sort of talk about why it was necessary, or why he felt the need to target drugs in particular based on what was happening in the country at this time. So in the 1960s, we see a couple different things happening both politically, economically, and socially. Politically, what we're talking about here is largely the presence that the United States had in Vietnam at the time, and we were engaged in a conflict that many felt like we didn't need to be part of. But as a peacekeeping nation, we felt obligated to send our military to South Vietnam in the Vietnam Peninsula to try and help stop the spread of communism at the time. And what's important about Vietnam, not from a military perspective, but from a geographical one, is that Vietnam is sort of smack dab right in the middle of what we would call the Golden Triangle. And the Golden Triangle was, at the time, and it still in part is, but at the time, in its heyday, was the epicenter for opioid distribution for the entire world pretty much. So you had a lot of soldiers being sent over to Vietnam, and they were smack dab in the middle of this giant market for opioids, and you saw everybody coming back to the United States. Not everybody, but a good portion, enough that it was concerning. You saw these soldiers coming back with specifically heroin habits, addiction, and a heavy use of marijuana. So with marijuana, we're really not talking about the same level of concern for dependence, and certainly not for overdose. But with heroin, that's a very strong street drug. So there's a lot of concern about addiction, dependence, and in particular overdose. Domestically, what you saw was sort of a different type of drug culture, or a different type of drug movement. So the establishment was very much anti-drugs, anti-everything, right? And in contrast, you had the counterculture happening, which we know all about, free love and hippies and all of that kind of stuff that was taking place at the same time. But a large part of the counterculture movement was the promotion of legalization for a lot of different substances. Marijuana was the main one and was the most popular type of street drug, largely on college campuses. But then you had other figures like Timothy Leary at the time, who was essentially part of the establishment and broke ranks and became part of the counterculture movement, with a lot of his excuse me, a lot of his advocacy work focusing on the promotion of LSD and trying to make that drug mainstream. And basically what you're doing is creating an environment in which the establishment is panicking really fast, because they're doing everything, the counterculture movement and the soldiers that are coming back from Vietnam are doing everything that the mainstream establishment does not want them to do. So in the mid-60s, during the Johnson administration, you see a strong, significant rise in drug use from those two, in part from those two events that I just talked about. And the Johnson administration passed the Narcotics Addict Rehabilitation Act of 1966, and this act specifically addressed the idea of narcotic addiction, and was really the first key piece of federal legislation that addressed addiction as an illness or a disease and separated it out from the legal status of addiction in terms of a criminal term. So at this point, what it's basically suggesting is that addiction is not a crime. The use of drugs is the crime, but the physical addiction and illness and disease that comes from that use cannot be criminalized. Instead, we want to try and rehabilitate, try and get people clean, get them sober, and release that addiction. But however, the act that was passed in 1966 did not really have that much of a broad sort of major impact the way that the administration was hoping, because there was just not enough funding that was being appropriated for treatment of drug users, and it really could not do anything to counteract the strong demand for drugs in the late 1960s and early 1970s. However, what it did do was sort of lay the groundwork for future federal expenditures on drug abuse treatment. So jump a few years ahead to 1971 with the Nixon administration, and we see that formal declaration that Nixon makes declaring that there is a war on drugs. And in that declaration, he proclaimed, and I want to use his exact words here. So Nixon said, quote, "America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive." End quote. So you can see there that it's very militaristic types of language, and Nixon is attempting at this point not just to treat the drug user, but also to get at the supply sources. So we're talking about fighting for one of the first times on a large epic scale, fighting the suppliers, not in addition to trying to help the drug users. So this is kind of a counterintuitive for a conservative president, specifically on the treatment front, not necessarily on the supply front, but very much so on the treatment front. So Nixon's policies are setting out to increase the funding that the Johnson administration policies didn't have, and they're increasing the funding that goes towards the treatment programs. And it was actually through this legislation that Nixon passed in 1971 that we see the establishment of methadone maintenance programs. And now methadone maintenance is a very commonplace type of thing, especially in today's climate where we have a ever-growing sorry, I can't talk this morning. It's early, I'm recording, sorry. In today's climate, we see an ever-increasing dependence on opioids, on opioids that have to largely be treated by methadone maintenance, especially if we're talking about things like heroin, if you can somehow get your hands on morphine or a lot of the prescription pill opioids. The withdrawal from that is very strong and can actually cause you to die from the withdrawal itself. So many opioid users start methadone maintenance programs that lower the amount of opioids in your body without actually killing you from the withdrawal. You can't withdraw from opioids cold turkey like you could on cigarettes or marijuana or something like that. It's a very strong, harsh withdrawal, and it often causes more trouble than the actual drug use. So anyway, methadone maintenance is established, and a pretty groundbreaking thing, again, for a conservative president at the time to say we're going to treat drug addiction with another drug that will help wean you off, instead of just saying, you know, you're sort of out there on your own, good luck, stop using drugs. So while that aspect of Nixon's drug policies is certainly a favorable one, the other side of the coin, when talking about these policies, really lays the groundwork for a very harmful, strict legal environment for drug users down the line. And the Declaration against drug use, the war on drugs, the formal proclamation, is the tipping point that really creates a wave of legislation that causes a lot of harm over the next 3 to 4 decades, let's say. So because Nixon has this idea that, addiction is a disease, and it is, his policies really focus predominantly on that at the drug user level. And he really went out of his way to try and make sure that there was language in there that would help the drug user. However, he also wanted to go after the traffickers and the dealers in terms of criminal prosecution, not the user here. His thought process was that if you got rid of the supply, you get the user into treatment, then you were creating a rather better environment all around. In theory, this is true to an extent. However, basic economic principles would dictate that when you limit the supply, the demand goes way up, and then so does the value of the item that is in limited supply. So if you're trying to eradicate all of the marijuana, all of the cocaine, all of the other opioid type drugs from the streets, and people are still trying to use, you're driving the demand way up, and the cost of the drugs is going to go up in turn. And people can't afford it, right? Regular street users cannot afford this. So it then sort of has to force the suppliers to become innovative in terms of what they can actually push out to the users. However, before he really could go after the suppliers in terms of prosecution, what he had to do was come up with a way in which the drugs would be targeted in terms of potential for addiction, in terms of potential for abuse, harm, overdose, all of that stuff. So before the 1971 formal declaration of the war on drugs, Nixon needed Congress to get on board with a key piece of legislation called the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, and this was passed in 1970. And essentially what this does is it creates a series of drug schedules that was part of a subsection of the legislation called the Controlled Substances Act. And within the Controlled Substances Act, we see 5 schedules for drug classification, 1 through 5, 1 being the most harmful, 5 being the least harmful. Schedule 1 is basically everything that you would think of that is, with the exception of marijuana, everything that is truly harmful, has no medical or has no recognized medical value, has a strong potential for abuse, addiction, overdose, all of that stuff. And then in Schedule 5, you see the polar opposite. Schedule 5 drugs are things that are over-the-counter, non-prescription type drugs, have limited to no potential for abuse, near impossibility of overdosing unless you just drink a ton of cough medicine or something like that. But it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to overdose from these drugs. So in that Schedule 1, you're seeing things like LSD, heroin, ecstasy, quaaludes, peyote, stuff like that. But included in that conversation is the idea of marijuana. And marijuana is obviously something that is at a crucial point within this country, and we'll talk about legalization in just a little bit. But at this time in 1970, the Nixon administration has it classified as a Schedule 1 drug, which means there's no recognized medicinal value, high potential for abuse, high potential for overdose. Those two things we know are not very true. Even though you can use marijuana a lot, your body does not become addicted to it or dependent on it in the same way that it would become on heroin. The withdrawal is not severe or strong. You cannot die from the withdrawal, and you certainly cannot overdose from this drug. But again, we'll get to marijuana in just a little bit when we talk about legalization. However, what's also important about this, if you remember from a few minutes ago, what I talked about was the idea of criminal prosecution. So before Nixon could target these drugs in terms of criminal prosecution, he first had to have them classified. And because they are now classified the way they are, Schedule 1 drugs are prosecuted more harshly than Schedule 2, which are prosecuted more harshly than 3, and so on, right? But I need someone to actually enforce this for me. So in 1973, in one of his last acts as president, Nixon establishes the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA, which essentially replaces the outdated Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs that was established in the 1920s. And this is, like I said, one of the last actions that Nixon will take as president regarding the war on drugs before he resigns a year later. In comes Jimmy Carter, and the Carter administration works very hard to actually try and decriminalize marijuana and do a reverse on the previous policies that Nixon had put in place. So a few years down the line, we have a new administration coming in, and they said marijuana is not a harsh drug. It's not harmful in the way that these other drugs are. It has been classified and scheduled too strongly. This is not how this should be. This is very interesting because within the Nixon administration, there were many key advisors who said we should not schedule marijuana as a Schedule I drug, and it should be decriminalized because it's a naturally growing plant that does have these psychoactive properties to it, but it is not addicting, it is not harmful in the way that these other synthetic types of drugs are. However, Nixon in particular was very much about the establishment and hated everything that Timothy Leary, the counterculture, everything that they stood for, and specifically said, I understand that marijuana is not harmful in the way that these other drugs are, but I hate it. I absolutely hate what the other side is doing. We're going to keep it as it is. And this is actually a very true story. And if you look into it more, some of these advisors were talking after the Nixon administration was done, after Nixon passed away, and talked about some of these meetings and things, and talked about how he specifically targeted marijuana for more social and political reasons rather than for the effects of the drug itself. However, when we're talking, okay, I'm getting off track. So back to Carter and back to his idea of decriminalization. So decriminalization is not the same as legalization. At that point, at this time, not the same. Decriminalization basically means you would not get any sort of criminal sanction for it. It would not go on your record. You would not go to prison or jail for it. Decriminalization basically means we'll still take the pot away from you, but you'll only get a fine for it. So it's very similar to if you were to run a stoplight or a stop sign. You would get a fine, you would get a ticket, but there's no type of incarceration or no threat of incarceration or any sort of larger penalty as long as you pay the fine. But again, when we're talking about decriminalization, this is not a widespread blanket type of initiative that would allow a free-for-all for any type of marijuana use. When we're talking about decriminalization at this point in time, we're talking about small personal use amounts of marijuana. Normally, when we're talking about that, it's anything less than an ounce, or I guess up to an ounce, and an ounce is the equivalent of 28 grams of marijuana. So again, very small amounts rather than large quantities like a pound or something like that. But nobody really got on board with it except I think maybe Oregon or Washington. One or two states went towards this route, but the large spread decriminalization attempts that Carter was aiming for never really panned out. So marijuana stays as a Schedule I drug up until this day. At the time of this recording, it is still considered a Schedule I drug and is still illegal at the federal level, despite legalization. But again, we'll get into that in just a minute. So we're moving our way out of the 70s into the 80s, and the 60s and 70s was all about opioids and all about marijuana. The 1980s is largely dominated over concerns regarding cocaine use. Cocaine is actually a Schedule II drug, which means it does have some medically recognized value. It is a numbing agent. Largely, it's only used medicinally in hospitals if you're allergic to every other type of anesthetic. But cocaine, if you ever see, not that you might know many cocaine users, but if you ever have watched a powder cocaine user after they snort a line, they might pick up the little bit of residue off the table and they'll rub their gums. And they're trying to use every last little bit of it because powder is really expensive. But that will numb their gums and they'll be able to use the last little bit that they were unable to snort. So in hospitals, it's used largely in small outpatient surgeries as a topical numbing agent, but it does have some medicinal value. But in the 1980s, that's not what people were using it for. In the 1980s, it largely became known as a popular party drug, and cocaine at this time was coming in, by the boatload from Colombia, and it was very, very potent. So powder was very expensive. And if you're thinking about consumer accessibility, not everybody is going to be able to afford that. However, I could afford a cheaper version of it. And remember earlier in the lecture that when you're trying to eradicate supply and demand goes way up, so does the value. So we're talking about drug suppliers that are now becoming more innovative. So if powder is too expensive, I need to start making a cut form of the powder. So you might be aware, but if you're taking pure powder cocaine, you can then transform it into crack cocaine. If you take pure powder and you cut it with baking soda, this is now a form of freebasing cocaine, or if you cut it with ammonia, that's considered crack. Ammonia turns it into that crystallized form that you can then cook down, and either way, you're talking about a smokable form of the drug. Powder is meant to be snorted, and then a smokable form of cocaine, crack, you can light up and smoke in a pipe. And anytime really, okay, so in order for your body to get high, the drug of choice needs to make it into your bloodstream. And if you're snorting, it has to make its way through your nasal cavity, through the passages, all there. It takes a little longer. If you're smoking a drug, it gets right into your lungs and goes out the blood vessels in your lungs and is instantaneously in your system. So smoking a drug is one of the fastest ways to intoxication. The only other one that's as instantaneously driven as smoking is intravenous drug use. So there you're just injecting straight right into your bloodstream. So smoking or intravenous drug use, fastest ways. The problem with a fast high is that people often assume that the high is stronger. If you're snorting, you have to wait a little while before it gets in your system, and it's a slower build kind of high. If you're smoking, it's instantaneous. The same with marijuana. If you smoke marijuana, you're high very fast. If you take an edible, right, because that's the new craze with legalization. If you have a pot brownie or you eat pot gummy bears or pot whatever, right, if you turn marijuana into butter and you cook with it, and you eat it, it has to go out your stomach lining in order for it to get into your bloodstream. So it takes longer. Smoking it will get you high a lot faster. But like I said, anytime you smoke something, because the high is instantaneous, people automatically assume that whatever you're smoking must be stronger, must be more potent, must be more harsh than whatever the other form of the drug is. However, when we're talking about smoking cocaine or we're talking about snorting cocaine, pharmacologically, these drugs are pretty much identical in terms of strength. It's just with powder, it's more of a delayed reaction. The same thing if you were to take cough medicine in pill form versus liquid form, right? It's the same medication, it's just delivered in a different format, and therefore it takes a little bit more time for it to get through your system. And that's really what we're talking about with cocaine here. You have two different formats. One creates an instant high, one is a delayed high, but it promotes the misconception that crack is more harmful and more addictive than powder cocaine. And it helped in part aid the legislation that was being passed during the Reagan administration that would cut down on, or was trying to target specifically, cocaine users and cocaine suppliers. And basically what it led to was the sentencing enhancements that created a strong disparity in terms of how law enforcement and the courts could target crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. And if you're not aware, and I'm sure at this point you probably are all aware, but in case you're not, this legislation that I'm talking about essentially created a sentencing ratio for possession. So the ratio was 100 to 1. So you could have 100 grams of powder cocaine, and that was equivalent in terms of prosecution to 1 gram of crack cocaine. So if you had 100 grams and everything else was equal, my criminal record, everything else was equal across the board between the two defendants. Defendant A has 100 grams of powder, defendant B has 1 gram of crack. We would be sentenced to prison for the same amount of time, all other things being equal. So it's a very strong disparity. And what this disparity basically did was it targeted minorities, because a lot of low-income minority individuals could not afford to use powder, so they went after the cheaper one, which was crack. So these sentencing enhancements put a lot of minority low-income individuals in prisons for a long time, simply because they couldn't afford the stronger version of the drug itself. So there's a lot wrong with this legislation at this time. And this ratio is put in place, and it is kept there all the way until 2010. And during the first Obama administration, we see not a total elimination of the ratio in terms of sentencing enhancements, but we see things being cut down. So the current ratio that exists after the legal reforms in 2010 is an 18 to 1 ratio. So you can now be sentenced to the same amount of incarceration time if you have 18 grams of powder cocaine compared to 1 gram of crack cocaine. So it's not ideal by any means, but it's a lot better than that 100 to 1 sentencing ratio that we've seen before. So the sentencing enhancements that come out of the Reagan administration in the 1980s are really the thing that messes up the system for everybody, and is really the legislation that is creating an overly inflated sense of incarceration. And we're seeing that steady flow of prisoners into prisons, out of prisons, then they come back in because they don't have any marketable skills, and it becomes a whole reentry conversation. But specifically, these pieces of legislation that come out of the Reagan administration are responsible for the overinflation of our incarceration numbers, and there's many of them are still on the books. And these laws are leaving a lot of communities without fathers and mothers, and we're seeing a generation of incarcerated individuals that have been left behind in prisons because this legislation is crafted in such a way that it strongly targets low-income and minority individuals. And this is a criticism of these laws for many, many years. I'm not saying anything brand new, but it just needs to be reiterated that they were crafted in such a way that it was not equitable prosecution across the board. So from the 1980s into Bush Sr., into the Clinton administration, and even so much into George H.W. Bush's administration, we're seeing a continued progression and promotion of the war on drugs. But it's really not until, I would say, probably the second administration of H.W. Bush and into the Obama administrations where we start to see some reversal of policies that specifically target drug offenders. Because we know that the war on drugs is just a big, massive, total failure, and that it did not do anything that we originally intended for it to do, and seemed to have a more harmful effect on communities, on users, did nothing to eliminate the supply lines pretty much, almost to the point where we're now starting to see a polarizing effect happen, in which legalization is renewed, and that conversation is now at the forefront of everything that we talk about with drugs. So you still have everybody saying, harsher street drugs should not be legalized. Opioids need to be targeted specifically to try and help eliminate with that type of addiction and abuse pattern that we're seeing across the country. But marijuana in particular, it's not harmful, there's no problems with it, let's legalize it. So beginning as early as 1996, we see California become the very first state to defy the federal government and legalizes marijuana for medicinal use at the state level. And when I say defy the federal government, remember that marijuana, even to this day, is, at the time of this recording at least, is still illegal at the federal level. The FDA does not recognize marijuana as having any sort of medicinal value, yet it's being used in California in 1996 for just that. And even though it might not have a recognized medicinal value at the federal level through the through the FDA, marijuana has been proven to be a pain reliever, produces hunger in those that might be sick, so it's ideal for cancer patients. A lot of people with glaucoma, and I know it's sort of a running joke that people say they have glaucoma to get medicinal pot, but it does help alleviate the pressure in the eyes and the head for people who have glaucoma. It has a variety of pain relieving applications. So it might not be a pill form, right? And it might not be something that's produced by Big Pharma, but it does have medical applications. So at this point now, when we're talking about 2019, more than 30 states have passed medicinal marijuana laws in some shape or form. Even Texas is thrown in this boat, and we see that the CBD oil has been legalized for those with epilepsy, and there's even talk that we're going to expand this out to other different medical afflictions in the next few years. But really the big conversation is not focused on medicinal marijuana so much as it is on recreational marijuana. So when we're talking about recreational medicinal marijuana legislation, we're really talking about an individual's ability to walk into a shop, a dispensary, and go buy pot, the same way that you would be able to walk into a liquor store and go buy whiskey. It's regulated by the government. It's small personal use amounts of marijuana. The marijuana would be taxed, which is essentially a revenue generating business for the state. And then I would get to go home with an ounce or less of weed. So again, when we're talking about an ounce, it's 28 grams. It's a very small personal use. An ounce would really talk about a Ziploc size snack baggie would fit about an ounce of marijuana. So it's not a lot at all. And if you're not a chronic user, an ounce of weed would last you a month and a half, maybe, somewhere in there. So it's not like it's a huge amount of weed. However, the irony with this type of legislation is that many individuals are currently serving an incarceration sentence, largely in jails, for simple possession of personal use amounts of marijuana. States that have legalized pot have to put into place in these laws that it's retroactive, meaning everybody who is currently incarcerated for this type of offense can be let out because it's now a legalized type of activity. However, many states are not doing so because of the massive amount of releases that they would have to complete from these prisons. And regardless of how you feel about weed or whether or not you would actually use it if it went fully legal, I think an important part of the conversation is the recognition of the economic benefits of legalization. States that that have gone legal for recreational use are taxing it in the 30% plus range. Some states are in the 50-60 plus range. And depending on the quality of weed, the price is going to fluctuate. So 30% tacked on to $100, $150. Some strains of marijuana are selling upwards in the $200 range. So that's a lot of tax money if you're talking about a state full of users who are buying on a frequent basis. And basically what legalization is allowing for is this new concept of pot tourism. And it's very similar to how people might go to California and they'll visit Napa Valley and go taste wines. People are traveling now to states that have gone legal for recreational purposes in order to test out different strains, or they're just going for a vacation in which they can imbibe legally. This is not a new concept. In the Netherlands, Amsterdam has a very strong growing pot tourism market, and now we're seeing this pop up in the United States as well. And basically what that's allowing is for out-of-state consumers to come in and add to the growing market in these states. So not only are you getting money from out-of-towners in terms of pot taxation, but you're also getting people to come to your state to vacation. So now we're producing more money for restaurants, hotels, and just the growing tourism market in a lot of places. Based on 2008 numbers, you're seeing a lot of money being brought into different states in terms of total sales. So I'll just rattle off a few numbers here. In Colorado in 2008, Colorado sold more than $1 billion in marijuana. California sold more than $2.8 billion. Washington State is just shy of $1 billion. Oregon is over $500 million. And these states in particular, those numbers only reflect direct recreational weed sales. So we're not even talking about medicinal weed in those states because they are recreational. So these numbers are reflecting everybody who has purchased recreational pot and who are over the age of 21 to make that purchase. Colorado in particular is a very interesting case study to look at. Colorado went legal in 2014, and as of early 2019 at the time of this recording, the state has made over $950 million in tax revenue, just in taxes. So $950 million on the tipping point of $1 billion in taxes just coming from pot alone. That's a lot of money, a lot of money. They're pouring it back into schools, they're raising teacher salaries, they're decreasing incarceration sizes, they're erasing their state level debt. And this money has been such a great benefit to the state in so many ways. I mean, Colorado, it just exploded in ways that we did not understand it or did not anticipate it to really happen. Colorado is really, like I said, they're the poster child of how to do it and how to do it right. They're doing it in a smart, safe way. The dispensaries are highly regulated. People are paying a tax. It's working out well. And remember, like I said, we're talking about small personal use amounts of marijuana. So residents are able to purchase an ounce a day. Like I said, an ounce is 28 grams, and non-residents from out of state in Colorado can only purchase a quarter of an ounce there. A quarter ounce of weed would probably get you maybe about two decent-sized blunts, 3 smaller blunts if you were to stretch it a little bit. So just a couple cigarettes. We're not talking about a large amount of weed here. But again, like I said, from the consumer perspective, people are willing to pay the money to be able to use this, because before, if you ever wanted to be a pot user, you had to know a guy. And now you can just walk into a store and get some weed like you could when you go to a liquor store and buy some alcohol, and go to the grocery store and buy some grocery stores. It's just as simple as that. You still cannot use it out in public. You have to use it in the privacy of your own home, but you're paying for a substance that is not going to get you in any legal trouble in a way that it used to. But as the consumer, it's really creating an interesting market, not only for the consumer, but for the growers. So what you're seeing now is a large expansion in terms of the quality of marijuana and the potency of the weed too. So like if you were to go into a liquor store, There's obviously different variations in terms of the quality of alcohol. You have top shelf alcohol, which you're going to pay more for. You have well alcohol, which will get the job done, but it's not going to taste as good as that top shelf stuff. So the same goes for marijuana. You have different strains of pot that have different potency levels in terms of the active ingredient, which is THC. So marijuana strains that have higher levels of THC are going to cost you more than strains of marijuana that have lower or weaker levels of THC. So a low-grade weed is probably going to have about 15 to 20% THC percentages, and it's probably going to run you somewhere about 130, 150 an ounce. Higher grade weeds that are in about the 20 to 25% THC levels are probably going to run you 200 plus, depending on the strain, depending on whether it's indica, sativa, if it's hybrid, if it's a highly sought after type of plant that is a little more rare, you might go a little bit higher. So it's a good amount of money for an ounce of pot, but it's good quality pot, and it's a lot stronger than the pot that the people in the 1960s were smoking, so you don't need as much of it to smoke. So it's more expensive than alcohol, but in the long run it is safer for you, and there's no nasty hangover the next day, so that's good. But the idea of legalization is a very interesting conversation for me and for many other academics, because it's interesting to see this just strong, direct contradiction to federal law, and states just don't care anymore. We're going to get this money, and there is sort of a peaceful agreement between the states and the federal government that the federal government will not come after these dispensaries as long as they continue to sell personal use amounts of marijuana. We'll still go after the traffickers and the high amount users, but we're not going to go after the small personal 1 ounce users. Okay, so legalization. I really like the idea of legalization for economic and incarceration purposes, but I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because we could be here for a while. This lecture is another one that I could go on for a long time about, and I actually teach a whole separate course on drugs and alcohol at the undergraduate level, so we do go on about this for quite a bit. But the war on drugs, like I said before, has just been a total and utter failure. It's been happening for years and years. Nothing successful, nothing good has come from it. Drugs, they're not being wiped off the street, and instead we still see that people are using. Incarceration is still climbing, and we're flipping the script in terms of legalization of marijuana. And so the demand for it is probably at an all-time high for some drugs, and this legislation has done nothing but sort of make a counterintuitive movement in which drug use has become more mainstream, I would say, at least for some things. And because we're legalizing, we're taking the shine off of marijuana. It's now kind of this more novelty thing where, you know, if you were a user, you were using regardless of legalization. And now that it's legalized, people are willing to try it for the first time, might not like how it feels, and they never try it again. So it's sort of taking the shine off of it in the way that alcohol is no longer a fancy type of thing. You know, alcohol is there. You can run into Walmart, get a bottle of wine, some beer, or, you know, don't. But it's not a taboo type of thing that creates a desire to do the thing that I'm not allowed to do. And the thing that's also, I think, what's happening with marijuana anymore is that people are not as, don't feel as strongly about it because it's becoming more mainstream, I would say. So anyway, I'll leave you guys alone now. You've heard me ramble on enough for one day. So I'm going to leave you guys be. That's all I have for you today. Meet me back here next week. We're going to pick up and do our final lecture of the semester. That's going to be focused on innovations in corrections, and then we'll end the semester. So thanks, guys, for your time and your attention today, and I will see you all back here next week. Thanks. Bye.